Welcome to Love and Faith Podcast.
Idea of temptation. Like, how do we overcome these daily challenges, especially through faith?
Yeah, it's not just about our actions, but about cultivating purity in our thoughts and intentions. That's the harder part.
It's so true. Like, we all know we shouldn't give in to those big, obvious temptations. But what about those little insidious ones, the ones that pop into our heads? This source uses a couple of personal stories, really relatable ones, actually.
The first one that comes to mind is about a man who's driving along the California coast. So picture this. The sun is shining. He's got that ocean breeze blowing through his hair. One of those moments that's supposed to be peaceful and reflective.
Sounds idyllic until, boom, temptation hits you.
Exactly. And it's not some major distraction either. It's just a woman out jogging. But even that brief moment, that seemingly harmless glance, it's enough to shift his focus. And that ends up leading to a fender bender.
Wow. It really makes you realize how quickly things can go wrong when our attention is pulled in the wrong direction, even for a split second.
And that's just the start. You see, what's really insightful about this story is how it looks at the chain reaction that follows. The accident happens, and then comes the guilt, the shame, and eventually he makes the decision to cover it up, telling a small lie to his wife.
That feeling of wanting to avoid conflict at all costs, it's so relatable. We tell ourselves a little white lie won't hurt. But this story really shows how even small acts of dishonesty can have lasting consequences.
Exactly. This source really highlights how those compromises, even the ones that seem insignificant in the moment, they can really erode the foundation of trust in a relationship. And it's not just between individuals, it can even create distance between ourselves and our faith.
And it's interesting how that idea of like these seemingly insignificant choices having these big ripple effects, that's really clear in the second story we're looking at, right? This one's about a different type of disconnect, this disconnect from faith.
Yeah, this story really digs into that feeling a lot of us probably have, like feeling that wall between you and God.
Yeah.
Especially when you're trying to connect, like during worship.
You're in a place that should foster that closeness, that connection, but instead of feeling close to God, you just feel, I don't know, nothing.
Exactly. And it's so easy to blame yourself, right? Like, oh, I'm just not devout enough, not praying hard enough, maybe I'm not doing enough. It's a common trap to fall into.
It is. But what I find fascinating is that this story takes a different approach. Like, it asks, what if, right? What if those tiny distractions we face every single day are actually the things that are messing with our minds, creating that barrier?
It really makes you think, And they use the example of advertising, something we're bombarded with constantly. Those images, the jingles, the headlines flashing by, they're meant to grab our attention for a second, but maybe they're having a bigger impact than we realize.
Like they're leaving this residue behind, making it hard to really focus on what matters.
Yeah. Our minds are so full of noise, all those images and sounds and information, that it becomes hard to hear that quieter voice. The one that really matters.
And that's what the person in this story realized, right? They brushed off those distractions as harmless at first, but they came to see that those distractions were actually preventing them from experiencing their faith fully.
Which brings us to a super important point about purity of thought. It's not just some abstract concept, right?
Yeah.
It has a real impact on our lives, on how we relate to others, how we work, and even on our spiritual well-being.
So then how do we fight this? The good news is this source doesn't just point out the problem, it actually gives us some hope, a path forward, this idea of redemption.
Yeah, like it really drives home this point that no matter how often we give in to temptation, no matter how many times we mess up, that door to redemption, to reconnecting with our faith, it's always open.
That's such a powerful message, right? It's like, okay, we make mistakes, but those mistakes don't have to define us. There's always a way back.
Exactly. It's about recognizing when we've strayed, seeking that forgiveness, and then actively choosing to really align our thoughts and actions with those values that are important to us.
Which, let's be real, it's a journey, right? It's not like we hit some perfect level of purity and then we're good. It's got to be an ongoing thing.
Totally, yeah. It's something that we have to choose every day, probably every moment even. Like, what are the things we can do, the practices or disciplines we can build into our lives to cultivate that focus, and that strength to resist temptation?
It's a big question for sure. Like, what actually works?
Right. And it's going to be different for everyone. There's no magic formula. What works for one person might not work for another. Some people find peace and focus through meditation, some through prayer. Others might need to be more aware of the information they're taking in, set some boundaries with technology, or maybe even just take breaks during the day to disconnect and recharge.
I think the key takeaway here, and maybe even from this whole deep dive, is that we have to be intentional. We have to be proactive. Because even those tiny choices we make every single day, they all add up. They either strengthen that connection with our faith or they chip away at it.
Absolutely. And honestly, I think that's a really empowering thought. We have more control over our minds, our attention, than we often realize. And by making those conscious choices, choosing to minimize those distractions, choosing to connect with what truly matters, that's how we can start living more fulfilling and meaningful lives.
Food for thought for sure. And hopefully a little motivation to take a look at where we're focusing our attention.
Thank you for listening. See you next time. May God bless you.
Lord, I kneel before you. Among the many, I'm the worst. Forgive the sins I've committed somehow. Help me, save me. Lord, my heart seeks to return, lost in confusion. I forgot who I am. Time flies like flowing water. I'm turning back, I'm turning back. Help me, Lord, break the old me. Let it burn, let it burn. Time flies like flowing water. I'm turning back, I'm turning back. Help me, Lord, break the old me. Let it burn, let it burn. Lord, I kneel before you. Among the many, I'm the worst. Forgive the sins I've committed somehow. Save me, save me. Time flies like flowing water. I'm turning back, I'm turning back. Help me, Lord, break the old me. Let it burn, let it burn. Time flies like flowing water. I'm turning back, I'm turning back. Help me, Lord, break the old me. Let it burn, let it burn. Thy love is as the light in the night sky. Thy grace like rain refreshes my soul. Time flies like flowing water. I'm turning back, I'm turning back. Help me, Lord, break the old me. Let it burn, let it burn.